UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your hosts, Dr. Dean Bertram and Jen Durrell.
Well, I'd like to start the show this week by saying welcome back to my lovely co-host, Jen Durrell. It's so great to have you back with us, baby. You were sick last week. You had a side effect from a vaccine, right?
Yes, it was from hepatitis B.
Well, I know I was super worried, but also several of our listeners were pretty concerned too. We got a number of messages or comments asking how you were doing. So can you let everybody know how you're feeling?
Well, that was really sweet of them. I'm doing much better. I do have a few more vaccinations that I have to take before the fall semester, but I wanted to make sure that I did not miss this week's guest.
Oh yeah, he's a great guest this week. He's the founder and webmaster of Phantoms and Monsters. He's also the author of multiple books on weird phenomena, including his most recent work, Winged Cryptids, Humanoids, Monsters, and Anomalous Creatures Casebook. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce to our audience, Lon Strickler. One of the reasons I'm so excited to have you on the show, Lon, is because your website, Phantoms and Monsters, used to be a go-to news source for me back when I was presenting the weekly Weird Wrap-Up on the Area 1051 show, which used to air out of Kenosha. It was on AMWLIP. And I used to visit your site every week to find the latest encrypted sightings and the like.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, WLIP. I've been on there a number of times, actually.
Well, I guess you were probably on there because there were so many Mothman sightings down around there. We used to always track it, both myself and Dr. Destruction, on your site and also on the Wayland's wonderful Singular Fortean site.
Yeah, and for a couple of years now, Waylon and I have been working hand in hand on a lot of this stuff, so we've kind of got it pretty well covered, I believe.
You've been tracking this far longer than I have been. Have you noticed a big increase in Mothman and winged humanoid sightings over the last few years?
Well, this is something that has really been going on for quite a while. You know, we had the 3 sightings in 2011 in Chicago. Then it kind of waned off a bit. There was a sighting here and there. But, of course, when it started picking up again in the late winter of 2017, well, then, then all hell broke loose. It just seemed like we were getting, there were sightings everywhere in the Chicagoland area.
Well, I'm kind of curious. Have you ever experienced your own flying humanoid?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I had an encounter back in 1988.
Yeah. Are you interested in sharing that?
Sure. This was in the autumn of 1988. And at the time I was living near Baltimore in Maryland. And I happened to run into a friend who I'd gone to school with and had been in Boy Scouts together. So we sat down and had some lunch and started conversing about this and that. Actually, I don't think I had seen him for about 12 years. Well, anyway, he was very familiar with my paranormal investigations. Actually, he and I had spent some time as kids on the Gettysburg battlefield. And we used to sneak on there on the battlefield and camp out occasionally. And we've had some experiences together. So anyway, he was telling me that there had been some incidents at the Camp Conewago Boy Scout camp, and that some of the troops were experiencing screaming sounds, and they just couldn't understand what it was. And in fact, it got so bad that many of them had been packing up and leaving right in the middle of their time at camp. So he asked me if I'd be interested in looking into it with him. So, yeah, I didn't know what was going on. I had no idea from what he was telling me. So I met him and another guy at the campsite the next weekend. And, we trekked into the woods and set up camp along the Conewago Creek. And, by the time we got there and everything set up, I guess it was about 6 in the afternoon. And, we had 3 tents set up. So, it was a very uneventful night. We all, packed it in for the night. And then the next morning when we woke up, we were sitting around a fire, and the other guy mentioned something about hearing something moving about in the campsite that night. And I had heard of it as well, but I just figured one of them was getting up to relieve themselves or doing whatever. So I never thought much about it. But there was nothing had been misplaced or, seemed like anything was disturbed in the campsite. So we didn't pay any mind. So later on, we decided to go ahead and go into the woods and explore the area. And I don't know how many miles we hiked, but we were all through the place. And that area is pretty heavy. The woods is pretty heavy. Got a lot of game, wildlife, and it's pretty thick as well. So I think we were probably out about 6 hours or so. So when we get back to camp, I guess it's about 6 or 7 in the evening. And, we just sat down to, started eating and we're talking. And we were there most of the night just talking. And then about 11 o'clock, we heard this god-awful screaming sound. And it seemed to kind of fade in and out. But it just happened the one real sustained time, maybe lasted 4 or 5 seconds. We had no idea what it was. I couldn't tell if it was animal or what it was. So then, it happened again. And it definitely sounded like a child screaming. It was really eerie. So I guess this was about 11:30 or so. So we decided we were going to stay up the whole night. So, we sat around the fire, I guess, another hour or so. And, nothing was going on. Then I got up and started walking about, stretching my legs. And, when, you get that sixth sense that something's watching you. And I've had that feeling the whole time I was out there. So I guess it was maybe a little before 1. I went back to the fire and asked those guys, look, let's get up and walk around a bit, see if we can, go up and down the trail. So we got our flashlights, got it on the trail, and we didn't walk more than maybe 50 foot away from the campsite. And to our right was the creek. Now, the creek was pretty shallow this time of year. And, there was a lot of moonlight. I don't know if it was full moon, but it was enough there that you could really make out what was, was around. So we all three noticed something standing in the creek. And this thing had red eyes. I mean, that's the first thing we all three noticed. But by the time we got our flashlights on this thing, it just jettisoned itself up into the air. A loud whooshing sound. Now, what we did see, when we got back to the campsite and started talking about it, and look, we were all shook up. We don't expect to see something like that standing in the creek. And, when this thing did take off, it kind of got to its apex, and we heard the screaming sound, and we heard it going away from us. So as we were sitting there, the other guy said he noticed some structures on the back, which I did as well. It was hard to tell, but, this form was probably about 5 foot in height. And it looked like it had something on its back, which I believe were probably wings. It was a pretty good sized structure, but we never saw the wings open up. This thing just had the ability to jettison itself straight up into the air. So we got to talking about it. My friend, he was shook. And, the other guy and he decided they were going to go up to the administration building on the campground and stay up there at night. I wanted to see what it was. I was hoping it'd come back. So I stayed up the rest of the night, but nothing else happened. So, for years, I going up to the area a couple of times and looked around and never really thought much of it. Then when I finally started writing the blog, which was, I started in 2005, I went ahead and wrote an article about what had happened to me, 20 years before with that incident. And when I did, I started getting responses. And in fact, I got a response from a gentleman who lived upstream from there about half a mile at Dick's Dam. And he told me he had been hearing that scream for years. He never did understand what it was. And not long after that, I received an email from a scout troop leader, who had been at the same area we were at with his troop not long before he had contacted me, and said that one day that a few of his scouts were hiking and they ran across something that they described as a dragon. A 6-foot drag is what they called it. And they came running back all freaked out. And he thought they were fooling with him. That's what they called it, a dragon. And he had no idea what they were talking about. But he did think they were playing until he, read my account. And then he realized that maybe they did see something. Anyway, over the years, I have received I think the number is at 5 credible reports of this being in the Kanawha Creek. Now, not necessarily at the campground, but on the creek itself, because the creek does run for another 15 miles or so. As it goes west and east, it empties into the Susquehanna River. But I have had several people encounter the same thing. And in fact, I guess the moniker for they call old red eyes around that area now. So, I guess the last sighting that I received was probably about 3 years ago. So yeah, that's my experience. And quite frankly, what we saw briefly is, the description is very similar to what people have been seeing in Chicago.
Yeah.
I love that you start your book with that account, because it lets the reader know that you're involved with this 100%. And to rewind back to the beginning of the show and also to your comment on Chicago, one of the fascinating reports in your book, Wing Cryptids, involves a truck driver who had a recent Mothman sighting. When he was picking up or dropping off cargo, I can't remember which now, from Chicago's O'Hare International Airport. But what makes the account stand out is that the witness also claims to have seen Mothman when he was a boy back in the 1980s, and that was when he lived in Mexico. Most interestingly, he makes the point of noting that this earlier sighting took place a week before a massive earthquake hit Mexico City. Of course, ever since the flagship Mothman reports from Point Pleasant, West Virginia back in 1967, which were followed by the tragic collapse of the Silver Bridge in that town, many people have linked the appearance of Mothman to an impending disaster. And this leads me into a question from a Talking Weird listener, whose YouTube name is Nostromo. This listener had actually been asking for us to invite you on the show, Lon, and his prompting was what finally got me to ask you, which I'd been meaning to do, incidentally, since we started the show. Anyway, Nostromo's question is this. Do you see a connection between Chicago's Mothman and the corona pandemic in Chicago, especially in Little Village?
Not really. I don't particularly buy into the harbinger theories. What happened in Point Pleasant, of course, there had been sightings for almost a year previous to the bridge collapse. And when the bridge did collapse near Christmas of 1967, there were 46 people that perished as a result. So, this isn't a small town, with a major tragedy. I think the Mothman sightings were basically used as an excuse. People are looking for answers. And I think that's why it was attached to that. This harbinger or portent of doom theory with winged humanoids or winged cryptids has been going on for a long time. And frankly, after looking into a lot of these sightings, the only one that I really can prove that there had been sightings of something before the tragedy was at Chernobyl. People had reported seeing what they called the blackbird of Chernobyl, some large bird-like being that was seen flying above the reactor days before the incident. But, there have been other sightings and other tragedies that have been associated with these sightings that I really can't prove or find decent evidence that it had something, related to the actual tragedy itself. Now, as far as what's going on in Chicago, there's a lot goes on in Chicago. I mean, frankly, during the summer of 2017, when this story was starting to get out there, I guess during July and August of that year, I was literally having 20 to 25 phone calls per day, all hours of the night, people calling me, just regular citizens who were scared to death that these sightings would result in some type of tragedy. People were really scared. I tried to calm them down and tell them I don't think it had any real connection. I made a mistake early in the investigation when I was asked about that. And I kind of let it out there that, we're actually looking into this being possible connected to something that may happen in Chicago, but we really don't know. Well, that kind of set it off.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any connection, but quite frankly, we really don't know what this thing is. I believe during 2017 in particular, there were at least 3 of these beings in the area. Now, when I mean the area, I mean from northern Indiana into most central northern Illinois up into southern Wisconsin. We've been recording sightings within a radius of Chicago, I guess, of about 250 miles. So, are they all related? Possibly, but that area, historically has had a lot of winged cryptid activity. Not necessarily humanoids, but large birds, thunderbirds, pterosaur-like beings, other strange things. So, why it's happening, we really don't have any idea. In fact, it's interesting. In my earlier book, Mothman Dynasty, when I wrote about the 2017 sightings, I had everybody that was on our task force write their summation on what they thought this was. This was 10 people basically that had 10 different ideas or theories as to what was going on. So, it's almost still to that point. We really have no idea what it is. I think overall we may believe that it's some type of flesh and blood entity that is moving within realities for whatever reason. We just haven't been able to pinpoint it. As the years have gone by, there have been some more clues that have popped up that may actually associate this with some type of extraterrestrial activity, UFO activity. So, especially since these sightings have been more frequent around the O'Hare International area since October of last year.
There's a couple of things I'd like to ask following up on that. And one of those is there are reports which seem like there's a very obvious physical aspect to them. Like something will crash into the box of a truck, or something will be seen catching a squirrel, or a creature will land and bend a fence. But then there's alternatively all these kind of reports which completely go against the laws of physics, I guess. Man-sized creatures hovering without using their wings, flying in almost weird kind of side swimming style type strokes, keeping up with cars. Weight and size just seems to often, I guess, preclude bird-like flight, and I'm sure you're aware of all of this. So it seems very difficult to try to, for me at least, to try to box this into a physical entity or to a non-physical entity. Is that something that you struggle with these reports as well?
Oh yeah, it's a conundrum. It's a real enigma. I do believe, for the most part, it's an actual physical being. But that doesn't explain why we're seeing it in and out. There has been this theory about cryptids for the most part for years now. In particular, Bigfoot being an interdimensional type entity.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that's actually true. I mean, just from some of the anecdotal evidence that I've received over the past 40 or so years, I do believe that it can be indigenous in some areas, but I think overall it's coming from another reality of some type. And I believe that has to do with other cryptids as well. The winged beings and other type of unexplained cryptids, unexplained entities.
Lon, you mentioning that winged humanoids might be extraterrestrial or perhaps even associated with other strange creatures leads actually right into one of my questions. And it's in regards to an account from your book, Winged Cryptids. And I really wanted to talk about this one. And I remember actually first coming across the report before I'd read your book, actually on your website, Phantoms and Monsters, and talking about it back in the day on WLIP. And it involves a Mothman type entity and a classic grey extraterrestrial. And as I recall, a witness reported seeing those two beings conversing on a street. And they were also in the company of two human women who appeared to be hypnotized or in a trance-like state or something. And then I think they all vanished in front of the witness. Can you tell us a little bit about that report?
Yeah, that's a fairly recent report in the whole general aspect of what's going on. But this woman was who lives in Rosemont, which is a suburb of O'Hara. I mean, it's just to the northeast of O'Hara International. And we had been getting several sightings in that area before they started showing up on the actual airport property itself. But anyway, she said she couldn't sleep that night. So she went out and took a walk at night at a nearby park, which she had done in the past. She said she sat down there's a large pavilion there, and her attention was drawn to a small building nearby where there was a light shining down, from above it, where she saw this winged humanoid. And as she sat, when she was watching it, there was also a small gray alien. And then there were two female humanoids, possibly humans. I don't know what they were, but they seemed to be conversing with this being. And as she watched it, and she had been watching for very long, there was a sudden blue flash of light. And after this flash of light dissipated, the winged humanoid was the only being remaining, and then they took off in flight. She was really shook up about that because it took us a long time to kind of get her to open up a bit more about it. But I think the biggest reason why is because she was scared, frankly, because she had the day later, she was at work and someone actually approached her and asked her about what she had seen. Well, I mean, she hadn't reported this to anybody or talked to anybody about it other than sending us an email at that point. And this person wanted to know who she contacted, that they should be the only one she should be talking to. And, her description of this man was fairly benign. Quite frankly, I don't even know if this guy was even physical. It might have been a manifestation that only she could see. I'm not sure what it was, but it was very real to her, and it shook her up. I mean, it really did. She did not want to talk to anybody on the phone about it. I was able to follow up with her personally by email. I did an actual background check on her. She everything that, she told us she was, it was, it all checked out. So, I had no reason to believe that she was lying to us. She had later, after the incident, had a lot of problems with nightmares and, a few physical and mental issues because of it, which is something that some people do experience, But she was shook up. And, that was actually the first time we had any type of extraterrestrial or non-terrestrial involvement with any of these beings until a little bit later when there was a UFO incident on the O'Hara International property. And I don't know what they had any connection or not, quite frankly. But anyway, that particular sighting was about 1 o'clock in the morning. It was in the cargo area of O'Hara International, one of the cargo areas, but I think this was on the western side of the airport. Well, anyway, there is actually a small cemetery on the O'Hara International property. It's called Resthaven Cemetery. A very small cemetery. And this guy was out having a smoke break, and he was facing the cemetery, which was across the road from his cargo area. And he said as he was standing there, he saw this very bright oval UFO suddenly show up, zoom past him, show up, and started hovering above the graveyard, the cemetery. And he says as he watched, he saw a humanoid-like being ascend up into the craft. Now, of course, first question I'm asked the guy is, did this thing have wings? And he said he couldn't tell. But he said, first of all, it's 1 o'clock in the morning. What's somebody doing standing out in the middle of the cemetery and being abducted, So I don't know if there is a connection with these beings, but the fact that we've had some fairly credible witnesses, including one of my investigators, who have sighted and seen these winged beings on the O'Hara property, it kind of makes you think there is a connection.
Yeah.
I find it interesting that you talked then, and I'm glad that you did. You talked about vetting one of the witnesses, and you talked about credible witnesses, considering Phantoms and Monsters must be one of the biggest clearinghouses on the planet these days for these type of stories. Is it something that often comes across your desk, or does something often come across your desk where you're like, I'm not so sure about this one, and then you talk to the witness and you think, I'm just not publishing it, I just don't buy this story?
Oh, that happens all the time. Even with these sightings in Chicago, there have been many that just didn't add up. And, even after I talked to the witness, it just didn't seem credible for me to even print it. I've kept records of it. A lot of them just didn't add up. That happens all the time. I mean, you get a lot of different type of sightings come your way, especially ones that are phoned into you. We do as best we can to follow up. Of course, I have a group, the Phantoms and Monsters Fortune Research Team, that we try to actually investigate these sightings ourselves, or we try to get someone that we know to go into the area or go to the witness and talk to them in person. But you got a lot of dodgy reports. There's no doubt about that. That does happen.
One thing I really noticed in your book was how many witnesses of a Mothman or a winged humanoid type entity use the exact same shorthand description for what they claim to have seen. So many of them state that the creature that they saw looked very similar to the monster from the popular horror movie Jeepers Creepers.
Yeah, we did get a lot of that. And that just wasn't necessarily what was going on in Chicago. That's a phenomena, an association that I've heard for years prior to that. I guess, when people have these type of encounters, they invariably want to associate it with something that they're familiar with. And that's why I think this Jeepers Creepers character keeps popping up. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't look like that to a degree, but yeah, that's the association we were getting a lot of.
Yeah, and it's interesting how while there are those cases where there's that obvious similarity, there are also some differences which are quite striking in some of these flying humanoid cases, particularly from some of the earlier ones that you include in the book. For example, one witness talks about the beings she saw resembled, at least facially, DC Comics Hawkman, like it had a mask or a helmet or a face shield that looked like that. And I think another witness claimed the creature looked like it was wearing a spandex jumpsuit, and it could even see the patterns on the boots that it was wearing. So when you look at these reports, do you tend to think maybe this thing's manifesting differently, or do you think that there are multiple different phenomena which people are seeing?
Oh, I believe it's multiple. Those particular instances you mentioned, I don't believe had any real connection to what has been going on in Chicago. They were just other sightings that people have experienced. And, if you go through the hundreds of sightings that we've documented over the years, you will see a lot of different descriptions. Once again, I think people try to associate what they see with something that they're familiar with. And of course, the Hawkman thing comes up, or even Batman. I've had people tell me that they saw actual Batman. So, you do get that a lot.
And there's a lot of car swooping in a lot of these reports. Like, it seems the entities are attracted to cars. Either that or they legitimately want to be seen and or frighten the witnesses.
We do get a lot of that. Quite frankly, I think there's a lot of them that we just don't get reported to us. Why they do that? I don't know. I mean, I guess it doesn't seem that they're very shy about being seen. I mean, they do kind of put themselves out there to be seen, but why they do that, I don't know, but it does happen a lot.
Have you ever received any good evidence from anyone, like pictures or some type of EVP or a sound clip?
Yeah, the photographs, we have received a few, but quite frankly, they're not very discernible. These sightings seem to be very fleeting. I mean, they show up so quickly and then they're gone. First of all, you've got the shock value of seeing something like this. Then by the time you grab your camera, this thing's gone. Or it's at nighttime where, you can't take a very decent picture. I can understand that, quite frankly, because that happens with a lot of different cryptids, a lot of different unknown sightings. In particular, with these winged humanoids, they do seem to be very fast, very fleeting. And, I do believe there is some type of phenomena associated with them where they do have some type of, I don't know if you want to call it ESP or psychic abilities to kind of render the witness, halt them as far as even reacting like they would normally with anything. That does seem to affect people.
Yeah, that fear factor seems to be there a lot, particularly with the creatures that look, for lack of a better term, I guess, demonic. But in the book, other than those Mothman or gargoyle type creatures or Jeepers Creepers type creatures, or however people describe that entity, there's giant thunderbirds, there's flying manta rays, there's pterosaurs. One of the things I enjoyed an awful lot in the book was the Jonathan Whitcomb article that you included, where he talks about, he starts with the famous sighting of Dwayne Hodgkinson in Papua New Guinea, seeing an actual pterosaur towards the end of World War II. Do you look at those pterosaur sightings perhaps a little bit differently than you do, say, the winged humanoid sightings?
Yeah, I do, because I think the pterosaur sightings, for the most part, are relic sightings. I think these are actual beings that are on this plane, the Earth plane. Yeah, Jonathan Whitcomb has been looking into this for a while. And, he did originally investigate the sightings on Papua New Guinea. And in fact, if you do remember the Josh Gates in his early expedition series, the first show he did, and I don't know how many years that's been, maybe about 8 or 9 years ago, was actually on Papua New Guinea in reference to the Ropans, or these pterosaur-like beings. And he and I have talked about this as well. And he just can't explain it. It's a phenomenon. It just really threw him for a loop. But I think these are relic beings for the most part. Now, the fact that people are seeing them all over the United States, but particularly in the western part of the country and in the Midwest, upper Midwest, I don't know if there's a flyway. I've had several theories of there being an actual flyway from Central America through Mexico up into the United States, or but I've heard these sightings all over the country. I do believe it's a good possibility that these are actual beings.
One of the reports in Winged Cryptids comes from a witness in Ottawa, Canada, who sees this giant, very powerful-looking winged male entity, and the witness seems to identify this being in a spiritual or in a religious context and sees it as an angel.
Mm-hmm.
Lon, is that something you've considered when you've looked at reports like that some of these beings could be angelic, or perhaps in the case of Mothman-type entities, which I guess when you hear that Jeepers Creepers type description that we were talking about before, sounds like the polar opposite of that, like something possibly demonic?
Yeah, the Ottawa angel sighting, it's hard to even classify. I believe he did see it. It was some type of manifestation that was much different than what most people have seen, though he is not the only person to describe something that big in that part of the country, in the Niagara area. I had a sighting in an area just outside of Buffalo as well. It was something very similar. And I don't know if that has something to do with the area itself, but his description was basically that it was like an actual human-like angel or human with wings. Mm. But it seemed to just manifest itself somehow. Now, was this a spiritual being? Was this an extraterrestrial of some type? It's hard to tell. But yeah, he did kind of connect it on a spiritual basis. And I think he still believes it was something spiritual, but it's hard to tell.
It's interesting that some of these areas, as you mentioned in the book, is it the Ottawa National Forest in Florida? Somebody reports a strange floating or flying humanoid there with no wings and wrapped in a membrane or like a blanket or something. But I think you mentioned in there it's an area with a lot of anomalous phenomenon like skunk apes and UFOs, etc. Do you find that a lot of these reports of winged humanoids take place in what John Keel would have termed a window area?
Yeah, Southwest Florida in general, it has a lot of weird stuff going on. I'm talking, like you mentioned, UFOs, extraterrestrial, winged humanoids, skunk apes. It's just a lot going on. The Ocala area is probably the most active. That's a little more central Florida, but from Tampa down south into Pasco County in that area, there's just a lot going on. And in fact, during the period of time that we were investigating the Chicago phenomena, we had very similar beings seen in Pasco County, in particular the area around Zephyr Hills. We had 3 particular sightings. We also received another one, but I didn't receive enough information on that one to consider it, as opposed to what I received before that. But there's some strange stuff going on down there, and I've had people in that area investigating this since that's been going on, and I don't know what these things were. They were kind of described more of a gargoyle-like being that had been possibly killing deer and leaving piles of deer carcasses along the highway. Very strange stuff.
There are similar accounts in the work of John Keel, for example, and certainly in a lot of the Bigfoot literature, the idea that maybe these things do feed on deer or sometimes even on humans or sometimes on blood. I'm sure you're familiar with the work of David Paulides in Missing 411 and the like. Do you think that any of the entities that you're looking at could be part of a missing person problem, or?
It could be, I guess, but I don't really find any connections at this point, because the sightings that we have had, the encounters we have had, it hasn't really been that aggressive. There have been instances where it seemed to recognize the witness and maybe step towards it. There was actually really only one incident where this thing had landed on the hood of a couple in Chicago and seemed to be trying to claw through the windshield to get at them. But other than that, there hasn't been much in terms of aggressive activity. We haven't been receiving numbers of missing pets or animals or people being attacked physically by these beings. So, I don't think that it has any phenomena or association with what David Pilates has been looking at. But then again, I'm not going to say it doesn't, but as far as I'm concerned, it just doesn't seem to be a connection.
I'm always interested in various phenomena or various manifestations of potentially the same phenomenon that have similar aspects or similar tropes. For example, people being scared by a Mothman type creature seeming to project some kind of menace reminds me in many ways of some of the work that Linda Godfrey's done on dogmen or beast of Bray Road type creatures looking at a witness and projecting that same kind of menace. You're probably more aware of the broader sphere of cryptids than most people on this planet. Are there things that you've noticed from what would apparently be very different cryptid reports, i.e. a dogman or a Mothman or something else entirely different, that share similar aspects as far as their behavior or things attached with a witness's experience of them?
That's kind of a tough question. I guess, each of these phenomena, each of these cryptid phenomena have their own type of activity. I can't really say that, a Bigfoot or an upright canine or a winged humanoid show any type of connection, other than in some instances there have been different phenomena seen at the same time or very close to the same time as others. But beyond that, I don't really see much of a connection.
Is it true that your background was more that of a paranormal investigator or somebody interested in paranormal phenomenon?
Yeah, and at a young age, I actually was born and raised near Gettysburg, on the Gettysburg battlefield. And when I was very young, I spent a lot of time on the battlefield during the summer. As a kid, I would ride my bike, the distance to the battlefield and spend a lot of time there. And there was one incident when I was 8 years old. I was in the area what people call the Death Valley, which was an area between Devil's Den, the wheat field, and Little Round Top. There was a lot of activity that had happened there during the second day of the battle. And it just seemed like everything just suddenly opened up to me. I mean, all my senses were heightened. I could smell gunpowder, hear gunfire. I saw apparitions, movement. This happened for like about 20 seconds, and then it just suddenly stopped. Now, why that happened, I don't know. It was like maybe a portal had opened up. But, I mean, I did know at the time that I was a bit different, that I could kind of sense spirit activity. You can call it intuitive, clairvoyance, or whatever, but it's just something that was, that I was familiar with. And, I've been able to sense spirit energy all my life. So, it kind of got me interested into the paranormal aspect of things. And of course, this was back in the late 60s and even in the mid 70s when I graduated from high school. I did a lot of investigations on my own. Back then people didn't, they didn't even think anything about paranormal investigators. And when you did mention it, people thought you're a damn nut,
Yeah.
So, it just wasn't like it is now. It's not accepted as it is now. But yeah, that's how I first got involved with it. But then I had a Bigfoot encounter down in when I was living in Maryland, in Sykesville, Maryland, and after that occurred, that kind of changed my perspective on a lot of this stuff. I did know of Bigfoot at the time, but it was something I wasn't really interested in. I was more interested in spirit activity, even UFOs. But when I did have this encounter in '81, and then my subsequent encounter in 1988 with the winged humanoid, yeah, that kind of changed my perspective on the paranormal, and I kind of got involved more so in the into the cryptid activity and cryptid encounters.
With your Bigfoot sighting, did you hear knocks or did you actually see the creature?
No, I had an actual encounter with it. I was
Okay.
I was fishing on the south branch of Patapsco River. This was May 9th, 1981. It was in the morning. It was daylight, and I was fly fishing, and I'm standing in the creek or in the river. It was more like a creek at that point. And across the other side, I noticed the dog moving about in the weeds and such. And, I didn't pay any mind until I heard a yelping sound from this thing.
Mm-hmm.
And when I looked back over to it, this large, hairy creature stood up in the weeds.
Wow.
I don't know if he had hit the dog or slammed the dog or what it did, but anyway, this thing stood up, and these weeds were fairly thick and high over there, and but I could see this creature from its mid torso up. So it kind of stood there for a second, then moved off to my left and walked out of the weeds and stood there looking at me, and this thing was huge. I mean, it was about,
Wow.
I'd say close to 7 to 8 foot in height, very broad, hair covered, but the face looked more human than it did ape. I said it looked like a Neanderthal,
Yeah.
but it actually stood there and looked at me. I guess we were probably about 50, 60 foot apart from each other. It was making a clicking sound at the time too, which I figured out later was probably gnashing its teeth, which I've heard people describe that as well. It was definitely male. I could see the genitalia on it, and this thing stood there for about, I don't know, maybe anywhere from 5 to 10 seconds, and turned and walked swiftly up into the woods. In my case, the real story was after what happened, because I got in my car and took off towards town to report this thing. And when I called the police, they told me to go back to the area and somebody would meet me. Well, when I got back there, and quite frankly, it was less than a 3-minute drive back to the location. And when I got there, a state policeman, Maryland state policeman, was already there. And he had put a barricade up. I mean, I actually believe, and I did find out there was a sighting of probably the same thing earlier that morning downstream in Marysville, Maryland. And I think they had been tracking this thing for whatever reason. But the strange thing about it was, when I went back later after this cop run me away, even though I told him I was the one that made the report, he said, "I didn't care. You got to go." When I got back, there were people everywhere, and they had dogs and searchers in there looking around. They had a large white tent set up across the river.
Wow.
There were federal cars there. Back then, they used to drive these black Wagoneers, and there were several of those there. State police, Howard County police. I even heard helicopters. So I believe they were actually on looking for this thing at the time. Now, if they found anything, I don't know, but I do know that I had contacted the local television stations at that time, and they said if they hear anything, they'll let me know. But they'd like for me to talk to me later on. And when I finally did get back to them after a couple of days, they just didn't want to talk. I don't know what happened there, but I have actually had at least one, I had one local police officer, who contacted me years later and verified everything that happened. So, yeah, that was quite strange. But there had been what they called the Sykesville monster in that area previous to that, around the early 1970s, and there had been several people in the area who had actual encounters with it. And I actually went back and started interviewing some of these earlier witnesses and found a few other ones as well. And yeah, I was hooked after that. So I was kind of into the whole cryptid thing then.
I'm just curious, did you experience any lights or any anomalies or anything like that after you saw Bigfoot?
No, I did.
No, because I know there's a lot of correlation in between the two.
Yeah. A lot of sightings we get or hear about, and especially in recent years, there seems to be orb activity or even UFO activity associated with it. I don't know if that has to do with the sighting itself or the actual area where it happens. It seems a lot of this happens out in the Fayette County, Chestnut Ridge area. Stan Gordon has been discussing this and investigating this for years, where there seems to be an association between Bigfoot and UFO activity, and other phenomena as well. So, no, I didn't experience anything other than just seeing the Bigfoot.
We had Adam Benedict on recently, and he said one of the things when he was a kid that always frustrated him is whenever he bought a new UFO or a new cryptid type book, it would always have the same stories in it again and again and again, just written slightly differently. And one of the great things about your book, Winged Cryptids, and your site, Phantoms and Monsters, is there's all of these new fantastic stories and fantastic reports that people have just never heard before.
Yeah.
So on that note, and probably my final question is there another book we can expect from you sometime in the near future?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure there will be. I don't really know what it's going to be about yet, because I've kind of got a lot of irons in the fire. My last three books have been the Mothman Dynasty, Chicago's Winged Humanoids. But after that, I wrote a book about alien disclosure. And then, of course, this recent book, Winged Cryptids, Humanoids, Monsters, and Anomalous Creatures case book. And yeah, I'm pretty sure there will be. We've been investigating this upright canine phenomena here in Pennsylvania now for several years. That's constantly something that's been reported to us. But more recently, these pale humanoids, that sightings that have been seen in areas all over the world, actually, but mostly the United States. And we've been getting them in Pennsylvania more recently too. So I may have to steer towards that as well. It just depends on what kind of activity and stuff that's being reported to me. But a lot of this kind of comes in waves. I mean, all of a sudden you start getting, and I was working on something else before the Chicago incidents began. So, I guess it just depends on what happens, and you kind of got to steer to in another direction. But I'd say my next book will probably either be about the upright canine phenomena or the humanoid phenomena.
Either way, we'll have to have you back on the show because you were a great guest.
Well, I appreciate you having me.
Lon was such a great guest, with multiple stories of strange phenomena from eyewitness accounts that were so captivating. If you're interested in hearing more strange accounts, you can visit Lon's website, Phantoms and Monsters, at phantomsandmonsters.com. Lon's latest book, Winged Cryptids, Humanoids, Monsters, and Anomalous Creatures casebook, is available at amazon.com. Listen to Lon's podcast, Arcane Radio, at arcaneradio.podbean.com. He can be found on Twitter at Phantom Monster. You can also check out Phantoms and Monsters on Facebook at Fortean Research. Of course, you can always find us at TalkingWeird.com. If you haven't already, please like the show on Facebook and Instagram at Talking Weird Podcast. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to Talking Weird. We're available on most podcast platforms and YouTube. And if you enjoyed the show, please leave us a review. Dean and I would really appreciate it. Next week, we will be talking all things Sasquatch when we welcome Ken Gerhard, the world's renowned cryptid researcher and author of The Essential Guide to Bigfoot. Until then, stay safe and keep it weird.